And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Starting off with today's sea ice analysis, still a lack of ice here in Kuskokwim Bay into Nunivak Island, making this area vulnerable for coastal flooding with the storm surge expected to come in tonight into tomorrow in that area. So possible coastal flooding there due to the lack of ice and along with the strong southwest winds. For tonight, winter storm warnings through a good portion of the interior here. High wind warning for the Alaska Range, got 75 miles an hour. On the other hand, high wind warning ends for the eastern Aleutians this evening and for the Alaska Peninsula by 1 a.m. as the winds start to come down. But a lot of moisture continues to flow from south-southwest to north-northeast here, bringing a good shot of snow into the interior up through here. And areas of rain mostly in the Susitna Valley tonight, with more down to the southwest. And then for tomorrow, that front right about through this area to the east, warm, mild, wet flow, a real soaker coming up for the next few days here for south central Alaska with the flood watches out. And that holds right into Sunday. Colder air starting to come in from the west and northwest up here. That'll cut the precipitation off. And this will be in the form of snow here, mixed along the front, and then still rain for south central Alaska, all the way over to maybe some light stuff around Yakutat, but dry for the Panhandle. And for the coastal water forecast there for the south coast, northwest winds 20 knots, west-northwest 25 to 30 knots on the central coast, and the north coast not too bad, west at 15. Lynn Canal, light south wind at 15 knots, even lighter for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, northwest at 15. And northwest 15 knots continues for Clarence Strait on Saturday. Southeast 10 to 15 knots for the Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal area. Northwest 15 to 20 knots for the south coast. Central coast west-southwest at 15, and then east winds 20 to 25 knots here for the north coast. Prince William Sound tomorrow, southeast winds at 20 knots. North Gulf Coast south to southeast at 20. 25 knots southerlies for the western North Gulf Coast, and then some southerly gales here. Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands at 35 knots with 30 knot south winds blowing right up Cook Inlet. And that goes east for northern Cook Inlet on Saturday, dropping down to about 10 knots, but good gales here for southern Cook Inlet, southeast at 35 knots, southeast 40 knots Kamishak Bay, 30 knots for the Barren Islands, and small craft advisories for Prince William Sound, southeast winds 25 knots, and the North Gulf Coast, east to southeast winds 20 to 30 knots. Kodiak Island, south winds 30 to 35 knots. Tomorrow, south at 25 to 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula and southeast at 30 for Bristol Bay. And then for Saturday, Kodiak Island, south to southeast, 30 knots. Southeast 20 to 30 knots here, or east-southeast for the Alaska Peninsula. And Bristol Bay, southeast at 25 knots. And then for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, on Alaska Island, looking at east-northeast winds at 20 to 30 knots. Nikolsky north at 35, north-northwest at 30 knots for Adak and Atka. And then winds becoming northwest and then west for the western Aleutians. And then for the day on Saturday, western Aleutians west of Adak, northwest 20 knots. Adak and Atka northwest 30 to 35 knots. And good northerly gales here, bringing cold air southward into the eastern Aleutians at 40 to 45 knots. And here for the southwest coast tomorrow, southwest winds here south of Nunivak Island at 15 knots, south 15 for the Yukon Delta coast. St. Lawrence Island south at 20 knots, and gale warnings for Norton Sound, south 35 knots. Gale warnings also for St. Matthew Island, southwest at 35, west winds at 15 for the Pribilofs. And for Saturday, north winds at 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands, north 25 for St. Matthew Island, north at 30 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, but winds south at 20 knots for the Yukon Delta coast, and back to north at 20 knots for St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, northwest at 15. Big winds on the Arctic coast tomorrow, full gales here for the central and west side, 45 knots from the southwest in the Chukchi Sea, south to southwesterlies 30 to 35 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east to southwest winds, 30 to 35 knots. And then for the day on Saturday, winds coming down, all southwest up here along the coast at 15 to 20 knots, and the Chukchi Sea, west-northwest winds at 15 knots.